Hi guys, sorry about the little bit of a technical delay, but welcome to today's webinar. I am Rishni and I'll be hosting today's webinar. I think let's just wait for a few people to join us before we begin. But other than that, for those who are new here, welcome. Let me just tell you a little about who we are, who Legalese is. Basically, Legalese is a creative legal practice which has been redesigned, it's redesigned legal services to suit the creative, startup, and tech-based businesses by making them accessible and affordable and as well as understandable because, the legal jargon goes over all our heads most of the time. Anyway, so welcome if you're new. That's just a little bit about us. I think we'll wait 1 more minute for people to join and then we can get started. Okay, cool. I think we can get started. Okay. Today, we're going to talk about company secretarial compliance, easing your company's administrative burden and what that means. Just to introduce myself, I'm Rishni Ibrahim. I'm a commercial lawyer here at Legalese, and I'll be talking to you about the company secretarial compliance in today's webinar. Okay, so this is just what we're going to cover today. We're going to look at what a company secretarial is, the role and responsibilities of a company secretary, whether it is compulsory or not for companies to have a company secretary, how you would know if your company is compliant or not, what happens if a company is not compliant, the consequences, and how we here at Legalese can also assist making your company compliant and on track. Let's look at what a company secretary is. So a company secretary is not a secretary in the traditional sense of the word. A company secretary in this sense is not someone who brings you your coffee or takes your calls or books your appointments. It's not someone who sits at the office desk for your company. But basically a company secretary in this context is also known as a compliance officer, someone who's responsible for the legal administration of your company. And a company secretary is defined in the Companies Act as an officer of the company. A company secretary's job is to oversee the administration, compliance, and corporate governance of a company, especially for state-owned and big public companies, where those sort of things tend to fall through the cracks. Company secretaries are essentially responsible for making sure that the company's decisions are recorded properly, the share registries are maintained, so it's clear to whoever the other shareholders, like all the owners are, and they have to make sure that all the other elements of company compliance are kept up to date so that your company doesn't run into trouble with its shareholders or regulators. So this is actually something that you have to get right and you have to be compliant with. Let's look at the roles and responsibilities of a company secretary. So apart from a company secretary taking on the role of an officer of the company, Section 88 of the Companies Act outlines the duties of a company secretary. These are just a few to mention some, but we'll look at them in greater detail. So for one, a company secretary is responsible for offering guidance to its directors regarding the directors' responsibilities and powers, and they usually get those kind of guidances from the company's memorandum of incorporation or the Companies Act. So for someone to be able to guide directors of a company secretary needs to be pretty clued up on the company's memorandum of incorporation, as well as the sections in the Companies Act. Another role of this is to ensure that the directors of the company are aware of any laws and regulations that can affect the company. So for off the top of my head, the most recent one that I can think of that that definitely affects companies in South Africa and individuals in South Africa is the release of the latest POPI legislation, which is the Protection of Personal Information Act. A company has to be POPI compliant, whether they want to or not. It's now the law. And a company secretary would have to be clued up on a piece of legislation such as this, because it is a law that the company has to abide by. Another responsibility for company secretary is reporting any non-compliance with the memorandum of incorporation, the rules of the company, rules and policies actually of the company, and the Companies Act to the board of directors of the company. So essentially, a company secretary acts as a watchdog for the company, and that's why they're known as compliance officers. Another responsibility of theirs is recording minutes of board meetings, shareholder meetings, and or committee meetings. And usually these minutes turn into resolutions, and it is important to make sure that these resolutions are kept up to date and kept in a file somewhere or on the computer, because it will help keep the board accountable to, in terms of various laws and regulations, as well as ensure that the board upholds its fiduciary duties to the shareholders. So essentially, resolutions act as a paper trail of the decisions made by the board of the company. If decisions are not backed up by resolutions, it can cause a lot of issues for the company, and decisions can be overturned if it's challenged in court. Another responsibility of a company secretary is certifying the company's annual financial statements and ensuring that a copy of those certified financial statements are sent in accordance with the Act to every person who is entitled to those statements, aka the shareholders of the company. They want to know what's going on behind the scenes. Where's the money going to? The financial side of it. They need to know, and it needs to be up to date. It can also be requested at any time by SIPC, so those need to be kept up to date. And they're also essentially responsible for carrying out any or other functions that are necessary and required in terms of the Act, such as filing annual returns. What are annual returns? It is a yearly fee that is paid to SIPC. Sorry, I think I forgot to maybe define what SIPC is. SIPC is basically the Commission for Intellectual Property and Companies, and is the main it's the main sort of like bureaucratic entity that governs company registrations, company MOIs, directorship, and shareholders, and basically everything that has to do with the company, SIPC is in charge of. So now that we've defined what SIPC is, let's get back to the filing of annual returns. So what I mentioned is a small yearly fee that is paid to SIPC, and it is this fee is paid to make sure that your company is still kept active and that it's kept registered, because it was basically implemented to stop thousands of South African companies from becoming dormant, which is probably what was happening. Another function or that they have to carry out is the appointment and removal of directors. They need to maintain such appointment and removal of directors, like in a registry somewhere. But it's important to keep this up to date so that you know who is responsible for making the day-to-day the decisions of the company and who is responsible for running the company on a day-to-day basis. They also need to make sure that any change in company details, such as company address, is kept up to date so that you basically know where the company is situated. For one example of one of those reasons why you need to keep up to date is if you need to serve legal documents on the company, you need to know where they're situated. And lastly, company secretaries have to maintain shareholder certificates and share registries. This is important because you need to know who the owners are of the company. And the shareholders are the owners of the company. Okay, cool. Let's look at if it's whether it isn't compulsory to have a company secretary. So the Companies Act states that all state-owned and public companies are required by law to have a designated company secretary or secretaries, size dependent. Obviously, for the larger public-owned entities, having one person run the company secretarial department would not make sense. It would just be way too overwhelming. So in that situation, they'd have many company secretaries. It's mandatory for state-owned companies and public companies to have a company secretary. Private companies, on the other hand, are not required by law to have a company secretary unless the company's memorandum of incorporation requires them to have one. I just need to draw your attention to the fact that because there's the absence of this requirement on private companies, it doesn't mean that a private company is automatically exempt from observing the relevant requirements of the Companies Act from a governance perspective. While a private company doesn't require a designated company secretary to be appointed, the company must still comply with certain requirements found in the Companies Act as well, as mentioned before. An example of keeping your company compliant is maybe if you're a small to medium company, you could have a designated person in your company kind of take on the role of a company secretary or take on the tasks of a company secretary without being a designated company secretary. And or you could outsource the role and the services to an independent company that is able to assist with company secretarial services. And there are quite a few companies like that popping up on the horizon. Is your company compliant? And how do you know if your company is compliant? If you're a small to medium sized private company, how do you know? And you do not have a designated company secretary, or you haven't outsourced those services to an independent business company to assist you with those compliance services, how do you know if your company is actually compliant or not? The company and SIPC, provides a comprehensive checklist for company compliance, and it is accessible on their website. If you feel like you can take on this task by yourself, you can access it, like I said, you can access the compliance checklist on their website, and you can just tick all the boxes as you go through all those various requirements, and that way you'll know if the company is compliant. If you answer yes to all of those questions, then great, you are on the right track. But if a few of them have been left on no, you could run into some trouble. So basically, you need to make sure your company is compliant. Just to list a few of those checklist requirements for compliance from the SIPC website. It's things such as keeping records of the company document on hand and up to date, aka the company resolutions, keeping accurate financial records for the company on hand in case it's requested by relevant and interested parties of the company, filing annual returns on time, filing audited financial returns on time. However, this requirement is subject to a qualification, and this will only be required if your company's memorandum of incorporation requires you to do so. And last but not least, notifying SIPC of any change in company details and structure. So that is change of address, change of directorship, change of shareholders, changing your share class, authorized shares, etc., those you need to notify SIPC of any changes that literally have to do with your company structure. So, what are the consequences of non-compliance? What happens if your company is not compliant? So, unfortunately, if you're not compliant, your company and possibly your directors will inevitably run into some trouble. If your company is not compliant, there are hefty penalty fees for which your company can be liable. And in addition to that, The time and expenses spent on fixing the issues can become hefty and taxing on your company as well. So last minute scrambling to get compliant can be quite the mission, quite the effort. So rather to avoid those extra missions and extra expenses, just make sure your company is compliant. It's really not that difficult. It can also, non-compliance can also damage your company's reputation. And once that happens, you'll see your loyal customers leave. You won't get any new customers. They will be put off, and potentially beneficial partnerships may never develop and grow because people don't want to invest their time and their money in a company that's not compliant. And that leads us to our next point. The shareholders who have invested in your company, or investors, shareholders or investors, who have invested their money into the growth and development of the company, will be the ones to suffer. And yeah, I think that is like the tell of it all. Also, non-compliance across the enterprise and business network could result in a loss of financial opportunities with potential, with, like I said, new investors or tender processes if you are looking to work with the government. In addition, companies that place high value on corporate compliance may avoid doing business with you, as they would want to ensure that they meet their own regulatory obligations. Sorry, that word, just trouble coming out there. If you're a director of the company, you could be held liable for reckless and or negligent behavior, and you could also be held criminally liable for non-compliance. That is not a position that you would want to be in at all. No director or board member wants to face criminal charges for not ensuring that their enterprise adheres to the law. However, criminal charges are potential consequences for certain regulatory non-compliance, and that is something that you should just bear in mind. And while we don't want to scare anyone, obviously, with these scary consequences for non-compliance, this is unfortunately the law. Compliance is non-negotiable, and we are merely just the messengers. So let's talk about how we here at Legalese can help your company become compliant. Traditionally, the role of a company secretary has been a manual process, and documents have been stored in like a dusty file at the bottom of a rusty cabinet, forgotten about, never seen the day of light kind of vibes. But not anymore. Everything has been completely digitized, which is great, considering how long bureaucratic turnover times can be. So now that everything is digitized, we at Legalese now offer a range of company secretarial services, from annual company maintenance and record keeping, company registration. So if you want a private company to be registered or an MPC, we can assist you. We also help clients maintain their share registries and share certificates. We document any director changes, appointments, removals, you name it, changes of PEE compliance, we can assist with that, and so much more. And you can definitely check our website out for a more comprehensive list of our company secretary services that we offer. Our aim is basically to assist companies with the administrative slip and get your company compliant. And that brings us to the end of today's So Now You Know webinar. If anyone has any questions, please pop them in the chat and I'll gladly answer those for you. And if there's no questions right now, you can always pop us an email, or you can check out our website for more information. We are happy to answer your emails. If there's no questions, then I think that concludes today's So Now You Know webinar. Thank you so much for tuning in, listening to me. This is my first webinar, and I am happy to have done this and be here.